The Train to Nowhere, Act I. March 1945. Belgium burns. The war is ending, everyone knows it, German forces collapsing across Western Front, Allied armies advancing relentlessly toward Rhine and beyond, victory inevitable though timeline remains uncertain. But inevitability doesn't prevent desperation, doesn't stop final convulsions of dying regime, doesn't spare victims caught in machinery of destruction that continues operating despite lost cause. The camps are emptying, prisoners evacuated before liberators arrive, evidence destroyed, witnesses eliminated, systematic attempt to erase crimes before justice can document them. A train sits on siding near Brussels, 40 cattle cars coupled together, doors sealed from outside, interior darkness absolute except for gaps between planks where daylight penetrates in thin lines. Inside the cars are people, hundreds of them, prisoners from camps being evacuated eastward, transported toward uncertain destinations, moved like cargo across dying Reich, human beings reduced to logistical problems requiring solution through rail transport and bureaucratic efficiency. The train has been stationary for 6 hours, sitting on this siding without explanation, guards visible outside but offering no information, prisoners locked inside without food or water or knowledge of destination. The uncertainty is torture added to physical discomfort, not knowing whether train is moving toward liberation or deeper into German territory, whether delay represents mechanical problem or strategic confusion or simple administrative incompetence characteristic of collapsing military organization. In car number 17, approximately 60 prisoners crowd together, space designed for 40 cattle modified for human cargo through removal of equipment but no addition of amenities, bare wooden interior with single bucket for sanitation, ventilation inadequate, temperature dropping as evening approaches. The prisoners are mixed nationality and background, resistance fighters and political prisoners and Jews and captured soldiers and civilians arrested for unclear reasons, diverse group united only by misfortune of German captivity and current transport toward unknown fate. Among them is Henri Dubois, 47 years old, locomotive engineer from Liège, arrested 6 months earlier for suspected resistance activity, imprisoned in transit camp near Brussels, now being evacuated somewhere eastward along with hundreds of others. Henri spent 30 years operating trains, knows rail systems intimately, understands track layouts and switching procedures and operational protocols, expertise that makes current situation particularly surreal, being transported as cargo on systems he once operated professionally. He stands near gap between planks, peering through crack at outside world, observing switching yard through limited view, attempting to determine location and possible routes, using professional knowledge to understand situation when official information isn't provided. He sees junction ahead, multiple tracks diverging, potential paths toward Germany or Netherlands or deeper into Belgium, geography that determines whether train is heading toward liberation or captivity extension. But determining destination requires seeing which track the train takes, information unavailable from stationary position, knowledge that will come only when movement resumes and switches are thrown and route selection becomes visible. Henri watches patiently, professional discipline developed through decades of work enabling calm observation despite personal anxiety, capacity to separate technical assessment from emotional response even when circumstances are dire. Around him other prisoners speculate endlessly about destination and intent, creating narratives from insufficient information, conspiracy theories and hopeful fantasies competing in absence of facts, human tendency to construct meaning from chaos regardless of evidence. Some believe they're being evacuated deeper into Germany, argue that Reich is concentrating prisoners before final collapse, predict they'll be used as hostages or murdered to eliminate witnesses. Others insist liberation is imminent, claim that delays represent German confusion, suggest that train might be abandoned entirely as guards flee advancing allies. Henri listens without contributing, recognizes that speculation is pointless without information, understands that multiple outcomes remain possible, accepts uncertainty as temporary condition that discussion doesn't resolve. His silence irritates some prisoners who interpret quietness as indifference or superiority, but others respect his calm, recognize that panic serves no purpose, appreciate presence of someone maintaining composure when circumstances encourage hysteria. Among those appreciating Henri's calm is Father Michel Beaumont, Catholic priest from Brussels, arrested for hiding Jewish children, imprisoned for 9 months, physically weakened but spiritually resilient, man who maintains faith despite experiencing evidence that might justify losing it. Michel sits near Henri, observes his quiet watchfulness, recognizes fellow person maintaining dignity despite dehumanizing circumstances, begins conversation cautiously, testing whether engineer welcomes interaction or prefers solitude. Henri responds carefully, assesses Priest through brief exchange, determines that Michel is intelligent and emotionally stable, someone worth engaging rather than avoiding, rare quality in environment that produces psychological breakdown regularly. They discuss situation analytically, both avoiding emotional speculation, focusing instead on observable facts and logical inferences, conversation that provides intellectual stimulation amid boredom and fear, human connection that reminds them they remain people despite imprisonment treating them as objects. Michel asks about Henri's assessment of their situation, professional opinion based on railway knowledge that might illuminate uncertainty everyone feels. Henri explains what he observes, describes junction ahead and possible routes, notes that destination depends on switch settings when train moves, information currently unavailable but potentially determinable through careful observation when movement resumes. He emphasizes uncertainty, resists providing false certainty that would comfort temporarily but betray intellectual honesty that both men value. But Henri also shares assessment based on operational logic rather than just technical observation, applies understanding of railway administration to current situation, analyzes what train's presence on this siding suggests about German intentions and capabilities. He notes that keeping train stationary for 6 hours indicates either mechanical problems or confusion about destination, suggests that German rail operations are breaking down as military situation collapses, implies that systematic evacuation plan might not exist, that their fate might be determined by bureaucratic chaos rather than coherent strategy. This analysis provides strange comfort, understanding that incompetence rather than malice might determine outcome, that they might survive through systemic failure rather than organized murder, that collapse of German administration could work in prisoners' favor if it prevents efficient execution of evacuation plans. Michel appreciates this perspective, recognizes that Henri's technical knowledge provides unique insight, understands that engineers' professional expertise translates into survival advantage through superior situation assessment. Evening approaches, temperature dropping, prisoners huddling together for warmth, physical discomfort increasing as hours pass without movement or information. Guards remain visible outside, smoking and talking, apparently as confused about situation as prisoners, lower-level personnel following orders that higher command hasn't clearly established, institutional dysfunction visible in their posture and interactions, evidence supporting Henri's assessment about administrative collapse. Darkness falls completely, interior of cattle car becoming absolutely black, prisoners settling into uncomfortable positions for night, accepting that movement probably won't resume until morning, that they'll spend night locked in car without heat or adequate space or sanitation, endurance test added to transportation, suffering that serves no purpose except demonstrating complete powerlessness of imprisoned people. Henri remains near ventilation gap despite darkness, observes yard through nighttime rather than abandoning post, maintains watch even when visibility is minimal, discipline and habit keeping him alert when most prisoners surrender to exhausted sleep. Michel stays nearby, appreciates Henri's vigilance, understands that someone remaining alert provides psychological security for everyone, that one person watching means others can rest, division of labor that enables collective survival through shared responsibility. They talk quietly through night, conversation ranging across topics unrelated to immediate circumstances, discussion of life before arrest and families separated and work that defined identities, sharing that establishes human connection beyond prisoner status, reminds both that they exist as individuals with histories despite current reduction to anonymous cargo. Henri describes 30 years operating locomotives, expresses love for work that combined technical skill with physical presence, explains how perfect timing and precise control produce satisfaction that few jobs offer, reveals passion for profession that imprisonment interrupts but doesn't eliminate. Michel shares about priesthood, describes parish in Brussels and congregation that became family, explains how faith provides framework for understanding suffering without requiring acceptance of injustice, discusses theological questions about evil's existence and God's relationship to human cruelty, wrestles with problems that imprisonment makes urgent rather than abstract. Henri listens respectfully despite not sharing religious faith, appreciates intellectual rigor Michel brings to questions, recognizes that priest is genuine thinker rather than dogmatic believer, someone whose faith survives doubt rather than avoiding it. Dawn arrives slowly, gray light gradually penetrating darkness, revealing prisoners packed together in configurations that maximize space usage, human ingenuity adapting to impossible circumstances, collective adjustment to conditions designed to dehumanize. People wake stiffly, bodies cramped from constrained positions, sanitation bucket overflowing despite careful rationing of use, atmosphere thick with smell of unwashed bodies and waste, physical degradation that accompanies imprisonment regardless of duration or conditions. Guards appear outside, different personnel than previous evening, shift change indicating that some administrative function continues despite general dysfunction, routine that persists through collapse. One guard approaches car 17, unlocks door partially, slides opening few inches, passes in bucket of water and loaf of bread, rations calculated to sustain life minimally without providing comfort, efficiency of cruelty that characterizes German camp administration even when larger systems fail. Prisoners organize water distribution immediately, someone takes charge of rationing, ensures fair shares despite desperate thirst, maintains order through voluntary cooperation rather than imposed authority, demonstration of humanity persisting despite dehumanizing conditions. The bread is divided similarly, careful calculation ensuring everyone receives portion, mathematics of survival performed under observation of those waiting turns, collective discipline that prevents chaos when chaos would serve no one. Henri receives his share, small cup of water and bread piece barely adequate for single meal, rations that make clear this transport isn't designed for long duration, either destination is near or prisoners aren't expected to survive journey, calculation that Henri performs mentally without sharing conclusion, keeps observation private to avoid causing panic. He drinks water slowly, makes it last, professional discipline about resource management translating to personal survival strategy, understanding that appearing satisfied discourages hoarding by others, that modeling appropriate behavior benefits collective welfare. Mid-morning brings activity outside, guards conferring with someone wearing railway uniform, civilian official whose presence suggests technical problem rather than purely military situation, confirmation of Henri's suspicion that mechanical or operational issues prevent movement. Henri watches this conference intently, attempts to read conversation through gestures and expressions, applies understanding of railway operations to interpret interaction despite inability to hear words. The civilian points repeatedly at locomotive at front of train, gestures suggesting mechanical problem, indication that Henri's assessment was correct, that technical failure rather than strategic confusion explains delay. This observation provides useful information, suggests that movement will resume when repairs complete, that destination remains unchanged, that whatever plan exists will proceed once mechanical obstacles overcome. Henri shares this assessment with Michel quietly, both recognizing that knowledge is valuable even when knowledge confirms unwelcome conclusions. Hours pass, sun reaching zenith and beginning descent, second day of imprisonment in stationary train car, deterioration of conditions becoming serious, sanitation bucket requiring emptying, water rations exhausted, prisoners showing signs of dehydration and despair, physical and psychological endurance approaching limits. Some prisoners demand guards provide information, shout through gaps in planks asking destination and duration, receive no response except orders to remain quiet, demonstrating powerlessness that imprisonment enforces absolutely. But Henri notices something that others miss, observes civilian railway official returning with tools and assistance, work crew assembling near locomotive, indication that repairs are proceeding, that technical problem is being addressed, that movement will likely resume soon. He shares this observation with immediate neighbors, information spreading through car quietly, providing prisoners with concrete detail about situation, knowledge that reduces uncertainty slightly, psychological improvement despite unchanged physical circumstances. Late afternoon brings sound of locomotive coming to life, engine starting after repairs, steam pressure building, mechanical noises that Henri recognizes instantly through decades of professional experience, symphony of sounds that confirm train will move soon, that stationary period is ending, that journey toward unknown destination will resume. He announces this to car quietly, prepares prisoners for movement, warns that departure is imminent, gives people few minutes to prepare psychologically for resumption of transport. The train lurches forward without warning, sudden movement that throws standing prisoners off balance, reminder that they're cargo rather than passengers, that consideration for their comfort isn't factor in operational decisions. The train moves slowly initially, creeping through switching yard toward junction Henri observed yesterday, approaching moment when route selection will reveal destination, when technical observation will provide information that speculation couldn't determine. Henri presses face against gap between planks, watches switches ahead intently, waits for moment when track selection becomes visible, professional expertise enabling interpretation of railway infrastructure that other prisoners couldn't perform. The train approaches junction, switches are set, route becomes clear, Henri processes information instantly, understands immediately what track selection means, where this train is heading, what their destination represents. The train is turning north rather than east, taking route toward Netherlands rather than Germany, path that doesn't align with evacuation deeper into Reich, trajectory suggesting different destination than prisoners assumed, possibility that opens new interpretations of situation and potential outcomes. Henri's mind races through implications, applies knowledge of railway geography to understand where northbound route from this junction leads, what destinations are possible given track configuration and current military situation. One possibility stands out, route that makes operational sense given German need to evacuate prisoners while maintaining control, destination that explains why trains sat stationary for day while technical problems were resolved, place where prisoners might be held pending final disposition as Reich collapses. The train is heading toward Mechelen, Belgian city hosting transit camp, facility that Germans have used throughout occupation for processing prisoners before deportation, location that represents neither immediate liberation nor definite transport to Germany. But Henri also knows something that makes this destination particularly significant, information he possesses through professional railway connections that operated throughout occupation, knowledge about Mechelen that other prisoners probably don't have. The transit camp there is nearly empty, most prisoners already evacuated toward Germany weeks ago, facility that should be abandoned entirely as Germans withdraw from Belgium, location that makes no sense as destination for train full of prisoners unless something has changed that Henri isn't aware of. He shares this assessment with Michel quietly, explains route interpretation and destination analysis, includes caveat that information might be outdated, that situation could have changed since his last knowledge update months ago during initial imprisonment. Michel receives this information thoughtfully, understands that Henri is providing best available analysis despite incomplete information, appreciates that engineer maintains intellectual honesty rather than offering false certainty. They discuss implications quietly, both recognizing that Mechelen destination is ambiguous, could represent temporary holding before further evacuation or could indicate administrative confusion about what to do with prisoners, might even suggest that guards plan to abandon them as Allied forces approach. The uncertainty is frustrating but unavoidable, limited information preventing definite conclusions, acceptance of ambiguity being only rational response to situation where facts remain unknowable. The train continues northward through afternoon into evening, pace slow but steady, hours of travel that carry them away from Brussels toward Mechelen, journey that Henri tracks mentally through professional knowledge of route, calculating approximate arrival time based on distance and current speed, providing prisoners with concrete timeline when official information isn't offered. He estimates arrival around midnight, barring additional delays, prediction based on technical assessment rather than speculation, information that helps prisoners mentally prepare for next phase of whatever this transport represents. Evening brings another technical problem, train stopping unexpectedly on open track between towns, halting without explanation in countryside, stationary again but this time without switching yard context, breakdown in location that provides no clues about cause or duration. Henri observes surroundings through ventilation gap, notes isolated location, observes guards conferring nervously, watches locomotive venting steam in pattern suggesting mechanical failure rather than scheduled stop. This failure is different from yesterday's, occurring during active transport rather than before movement began, suggesting serious technical problem rather than routine maintenance, indication that train might be stranded in countryside rather than reaching intended destination. Henri explains these observations to Michel, both recognizing that situation has deteriorated significantly, that being stranded in open country presents dangers that stationary train and switching yard didn't, that isolation makes them vulnerable in ways that proximity to civilization prevented. Guards become increasingly agitated as evening progresses, their conversations visible through gaps showing tension and disagreement, evidence of confusion about how to respond to mechanical failure in isolated location with approaching nightfall. Some guards argue for abandoning train entirely, their gestures and expressions visible to Henri who watches constantly, observation providing information that locked prisoners wouldn't normally access, advantage that professional training in observation and interpretation provides. Darkness falls completely, train remaining stationary in countryside, guards maintaining perimeter but showing obvious concern about location, their vigilance suggesting awareness of vulnerability that isolation creates. Inside cattle cars, prisoners settle into another night of confinement, conditions worsening as journey extends beyond planned duration, rations exhausted, water gone, sanitation beyond inadequate, physical suffering that tests endurance increasingly. But Henri notices something crucial during night, observation that changes everything, detail that professional railway knowledge enables him to recognize as significant when others wouldn't identify it. The guards are decreasing in number, some personnel disappearing into darkness, not being replaced by relief shifts, gradual reduction in security that suggests abandonment might be occurring, that some guards are deserting rather than maintaining position watching broken train in isolated location. He shares this observation with Michel immediately, both recognizing implications, understanding that if guards abandon completely, prisoners might be able to escape, that mechanical failure and isolated location that seemed catastrophic might actually create opportunity for liberation, that German incompetence and collapsing discipline might save them where systematic efficiency would have killed them. They discuss quietly whether to share this observation with other prisoners, weigh benefits of hope against dangers of premature action, decide to wait until guard reduction becomes more definite before making information general. Hours pass in darkness, Henri maintaining watch despite exhaustion, professional discipline keeping him alert when most prisoners sleep fitfully, vigilance that has become automatic through decades of work requiring constant attention. He counts guards periodically, tracks their positions, notes when individuals disappear and aren't replaced, maintains mental accounting of security force that enables recognizing patterns invisible to casual observation. By midnight, only 4 guards remain visible, reduced from 12 earlier in evening, 2/3 reduction in security force that makes escape suddenly plausible, opportunity emerging from disaster, possibility of freedom presenting itself through combination of German incompetence and individual guard initiative to abandon failing situation. Henri discusses with Michel whether time has come to attempt escape, whether remaining guards are insufficient to prevent mass exodus if prisoners act collectively, whether opportunity should be seized immediately or whether additional waiting might improve odds further. They decide to wait until dawn, rational calculation that darkness complicates escape more than it helps, that moving through unfamiliar countryside at night risks getting lost or injured, that few more hours of imprisonment is acceptable cost for significantly improved escape prospects in daylight. Both recognize that this decision might be wrong, that remaining guards might be reinforced before morning, that opportunity might be lost through excessive caution, but they accept this risk as reasonable given available information. Henri settles into position near door, ready to act when dawn arrives, prepared to force door open if guards have abandoned completely or attempt escape despite remaining security if force seems insufficient to prevent it. Michel stays nearby, recognizes that Henri has become informal leader through combination of useful knowledge and calm demeanor, accepts engineer's authority naturally despite neither man claiming leadership explicitly, organic hierarchy emerging from competence rather than imposed through formal structure. Dawn approaches slowly, eastern sky gradually lightening, revealing countryside surrounding stranded train, Belgian farmland visible in morning light, familiar territory that Henri recognizes despite years of traveling these routes primarily at night or from locomotive perspective. He observes area carefully, identifies roads and buildings, locates landmarks that enable determining exact position, applies professional knowledge to understand where they are and what escape routes might exist. And he sees something extraordinary, observation that transforms situation completely, detail that makes everything clear suddenly, that explains mechanical failure and guard disappearance and why this particular location was reached before breakdown occurred. The train sits on tracks less than 2 kilometers from village Henri recognizes, community he knows well from personal history, place where his brother-in-law worked as schoolteacher before war, location that isn't random or accidental, that represents deliberate choice rather than mechanical coincidence. Henri understands immediately what this means, realizes that locomotive engineer didn't experience mechanical failure but created it deliberately, that civilian railway worker who repaired train yesterday sabotaged it carefully to fail at this specific location, that entire situation is result of Belgian railwayman's resistance. Sabotage performed so skillfully that Germans interpreted breakdown as random mechanical problem rather than deliberate action. The train is stopped here, near this village, not by accident but by choice, positioned for escape by someone who understands railway operations intimately, who knew how to disable locomotive in way that appears natural while placing prisoners within reach of liberation. Henri shares this realization with Michel, explains what evidence reveals, describes how professional railway knowledge enables recognizing sabotage that Germans missed, understands that fellow engineer created opportunity for escape, that they're positioned perfectly for reaching safety if they act quickly, that someone unknown took enormous personal risk to give prisoners chance at freedom. Michel absorbs this information with wonder and gratitude, recognizes miracle and technical details, sees divine providence in mechanical failure that enables escape, faith confirmed through practical engineering decisions that some unknown Belgian made to save lives. They discuss how to proceed, recognize that attempting escape now is imperative, that opportunity provided by sabotage must be seized immediately, that delaying risks German reinforcement or realization about what occurred, that acting quickly is only rational response to situation that unknown ally created at personal risk. Henri examines door carefully, tests lock mechanism, determines that forcing it from inside is possible with coordinated effort, that several men pushing simultaneously can break external locking system, that escape is mechanically feasible if attempted collectively. He explains plan to immediate neighbors quietly, information spreading through car gradually, prisoners learning that escape opportunity exists, that door can be forced, that remaining guards are insufficient to prevent exodus if everyone acts together. Response is mixed, some prisoners eager to attempt immediately, others fearful of consequences if attempt fails, standard distribution of risk tolerance that any group exhibits when facing uncertain choices between safety of known circumstances and danger of changing situation. Henri addresses concerns patiently, explains evidence suggesting guards have largely abandoned train, describes proximity of Belgian village where help likely exists, emphasizes that staying imprisoned carries greater long-term risk than attempting escape, argues that opportunity created by sabotage deserves action rather than passive waiting. His calm logical presentation convinces most skeptics, professional competence translating into persuasive authority, expertise enabling leadership despite lack of formal position or military rank. They organize attempt carefully, Henri coordinating timing and effort, ensuring maximum force applied simultaneously to door mechanism, preparing for possibility that noise will attract remaining guards, accepting that violence might be necessary if guards attempt preventing escape. Several strong men position themselves near door, ready to push when Henri signals, collective strength focused on single objective, coordinated action replacing individual powerlessness with group capability. Henri counts down quietly, everyone tense and ready, moment approaching when freedom or continued captivity will be determined through coordinated physical effort, when decision to attempt escape transforms from theoretical discussion to irreversible action. The count reaches 0, men push simultaneously, door mechanism strains under force, lock holds initially then breaks suddenly, door sliding open with crash, daylight flooding into cattle car that has been dark prison for 2 days, fresh air replacing fetid atmosphere, sensation of opening that produces tears and gasps and overwhelming relief. Prisoners pour from car immediately, dozens of people emerging into daylight, running toward fields and tree line, scattering in multiple directions to prevent mass capture if guards respond, instinct and planning combining an exodus from train toward freedom that lies 2 kilometers away across Belgian farmland toward village where help exists. Henri and Michel move together, staying close deliberately, recognition that partnership increases survival probability, that coordinating movement enables mutual support if problems arise. Behind them other cars begin opening, prisoners forcing doors using same technique, mass escape occurring along entire train, hundreds of people fleeing simultaneously, overwhelming remaining guards who fire warning shots but don't pursue seriously, German personnel recognizing futility of attempting to recapture hundreds of escaping prisoners when only handful of guards remain, acceptance of defeat that enables survival for everyone involved. Henri and Michel run toward village, legs weak from confinement but functioning adequately, bodies responding despite days of imprisonment, survival instinct providing strength that normal circumstances wouldn't summon. They reach tree line, pause briefly to observe whether pursuit is occurring, see that guards have abandoned effort entirely, understand that escape has succeeded completely, that unknown Belgian railway engineer Sabotage has freed hundreds of prisoners through combination of technical skill and precise positioning. They continue toward village, moving carefully now rather than running, understanding that immediate danger has passed, that reaching safety is matter of persistence rather than speed, that freedom is real rather than temporary, that train to nowhere ended exactly where Saboteur intended, position calculated to enable liberation, destination chosen to give prisoners maximum chance at survival through minimum distance to Belgian assistance and protection. The village appears ahead, buildings visible across final field, destination that represents safety and completion of escape, end of transport that began as evacuation but transformed through sabotage into opportunity for freedom. Henri and Michel walk final distance together, exhausted but grateful, survivors of transport that should have carried them toward death but instead delivered them to liberation, beneficiaries of unknown allies' courage and technical expertise, prisoners freed by combination of German incompetence and Belgian resistance, people whose lives were saved by someone they'll never meet, engineer whose sabotage enabled survival when systematic efficiency would have guaranteed death. They reach village as sun rises fully, morning light illuminating Belgian countryside, familiar landscape that represents home and safety, world beyond German control where life continues despite occupation, place where freedom is possible because one person chose to act, because anonymous railway engineer decided that saving lives mattered more than personal safety, because technical knowledge was deployed for resistance rather than compliance, because somewhere someone believed that every life was worth the risk of sabotage and consequences it might bring. The Train to Nowhere, Act 2. March 1945. The village of Saint-Cataline-Waver materializes before Henri and Michel as they cross the final field, small Belgian community that exists in strange limbo between German occupation and Allied liberation, place where authority remains contested, where Wehrmacht presence has diminished but not disappeared, where resistance operates openly in some areas while collaborators still report to German command in others. The village represents uncertain safety, better than imprisonment but not guaranteed refuge, destination that requires navigation of complex political landscape rather than simple arrival into welcoming arms. They approach cautiously, observing village from tree line before entering, professional caution that Henri applies instinctively, understanding that rushing into unknown situation after escape might recreate danger they just avoided, that patience now serves survival better than desperate urgency. Michel supports this approach despite exhaustion and desire for immediate shelter, recognizes wisdom in assessing situation before committing, accepts that escape success doesn't guarantee subsequent safety, that they remain fugitives in occupied territory despite breaking free from transport. The village appears quiet, early morning stillness broken only by occasional sound of animals and distant voices, normalcy that seems impossible after days of imprisonment, ordinary life continuing while catastrophe unfolds elsewhere, disconnect between civilian routine and military chaos that characterizes war's final phase. Henri watches for German presence specifically, scans for Wehrmacht vehicles or patrol activity, searches for evidence of occupation infrastructure that would indicate continued German control, sees nothing suggesting significant military presence. After 20 minutes observation, they enter village carefully, approaching first house on outskirts, building that provides cover if retreat becomes necessary, location that enables assessment of reception before committing to deeper penetration. Henri knocks quietly, waits, hears movement inside, steps back slightly to appear less threatening, positions himself where occupant can see him clearly through window before opening door, understanding that appearing as fugitive rather than threat improves likelihood of assistance. Door opens partially, elderly woman peers out suspiciously, eyes scanning Henri and Michel, assessing whether they represent danger or need, calculating whether helping strangers carries acceptable risk or invites catastrophe. Henri speaks quickly in Flemish, identifies himself as Belgian, explains they escaped from German transport, requests basic information about village's current status, asks whether German forces maintain presence or whether Allied liberation has occurred or approaches. His calm professional demeanor and local accent convince her apparently, her posture relaxes slightly, door opens wider, invitation offered cautiously. She explains situation rapidly, describes village as contested territory, notes that Germans withdraw systematically but maintain control of main routes, reports that resistance operates openly in some areas but German reprisals remain possible, warns that collaboration still exists and that some villagers report strangers to occupation authorities, advises extreme caution about whom to trust. She offers water and bread, basic hospitality extended despite obvious risk, humanity persisting despite years of occupation that taught caution about helping strangers. Henri and Michel accept gratefully, drink water desperately, consume bread while standing in doorway ready to flee if necessary, understand that lingering increases danger for woman helping them, that accepting minimal assistance and moving quickly serves everyone's interests better than extended hospitality that magnifies risk. Henri asks about specific people, mentions brother-in-law who taught in village school, inquires whether he remains here or evacuated, seeks connection that might provide more reliable assistance than random civilian encounters. Woman's face lights with recognition, confirms that Henri's brother-in-law Paul Deschamps still lives here, teaches at school that continues operating despite occupation, maintains position that provides cover for resistance activities, uses educator role to facilitate underground operations while appearing as harmless civilian. She provides directions to Deschamps House, warns that approaching during daylight increases visibility, suggests waiting until evening when movement attracts less attention, offers her barn as hiding place until darkness makes travel safer. Henri accepts this offer gratefully, recognizes wisdom in her suggestion, understands that rushing to brother-in-law's house during daylight risks exposing everyone to observation, that patience for several more hours serves everyone's security better than immediate reunion. Michel agrees readily, exhaustion making rest period attractive regardless of tactical considerations, body demanding recovery time that delayed movement conveniently provides. They follow woman to barn behind house, space filled with hay and farm equipment, adequate shelter that enables rest while remaining concealed, temporary sanctuary that bought them time to plan next moves carefully. They settle into hay, bodies relaxing finally after days of tension and confinement, physical relief overwhelming despite uncomfortable surroundings, safety's presence enabling sleep that danger prevented. Henri remains partially alert despite exhaustion, trained vigilance that decades of railway work developed, capacity to rest while maintaining awareness of surroundings, professional habit that serves survival purposes now as effectively as it served operational requirements previously. Michel sleeps deeply immediately, exhaustion overcoming priestly discipline, body demanding recovery that consciousness can't prevent, vulnerability that Henri recognizes and accepts responsibility for protecting, unofficial guardianship that forms naturally between men who have shared danger and developed trust. Henri watches Michel sleep with something resembling paternal concern, understanding that priest is older and physically weaker, that protecting him serves moral obligation beyond practical considerations, that responsibility for others' welfare provides meaning that pure self-preservation doesn't offer. Hours pass, morning advancing toward afternoon, sounds of village life audible through barn walls, normal activities continuing while fugitives hide meters away, proximity of ordinary life to extraordinary circumstances that war creates regularly, collision of normalcy and crisis that defines occupation existence. Henri listens to these sounds carefully, analyzes patterns, identifies routine activities versus anomalous events, maintains situational awareness through auditory information when visual observation isn't possible. He hears German voices once, Wehrmacht patrol passing through village, their commands and responses audible clearly, proximity that freezes Henri momentarily, instinctive fear response to captor's presence despite barn's concealment, trauma reaction that imprisonment created, automatic terror that takes minutes to subside even after voices fade into distance. The incident reminds Henri that escape doesn't eliminate danger, that occupied territory remains hostile environment, that reaching brother-in-law represents progress not completion, that safety remains conditional and possibly temporary. Afternoon brings elderly woman returning, carrying food and information, assistance that exceeds initial hospitality, commitment to helping that suggests either personal principles or resistance connections, Belgian civilian who chooses risk over safety, who extends herself for strangers when easier path would be turning away. She reports that German presence in village is minimal, explains that Wehrmacht forces are withdrawing systematically toward Germany, notes that Allied units are approaching from multiple directions, estimates that liberation might occur within days or weeks, provides context that enables better assessment of their situation. She also brings disturbing news about train they escaped, reports that German forces discovered mass escape several hours after it occurred, describes Wehrmacht response including immediate search of surrounding area, mentions that some escaped prisoners were recaptured while others successfully evaded, unknown how many achieved freedom versus how many returned to custody. Henri receives this information with mixed emotions, relief at his own escape mixed with concern for fellow prisoners, awareness that success was partial not complete, understanding that some who broke free with him are imprisoned again. Woman warns that German search continues, advises that remaining hidden for several more days might be prudent, suggests that approaching brother-in-law immediately risks leading searchers to resistance figure, recommends patience despite urgency, argues that protecting everyone requires accepting delay even when delay is frustrating. Henri recognizes wisdom in this counsel, understands that his desire for reunion with family shouldn't compromise others' safety, accepts that his needs are subordinate to collective security, that escaped prisoners' obligation includes protecting those who help him rather than endangering them through impatience. But Michel disagrees gently, argues from different perspective, suggests that Henri deserves reunion after months of imprisonment, contends that family connection provides moral claim that overrides tactical caution, insists that Paul Deschamps would want to know immediately that brother-in-law lives and needs assistance. The disagreement is respectful, both men presenting arguments thoughtfully, debate that acknowledges complexity rather than insisting on single correct answer, discussion that demonstrates maintained humanity despite circumstances that encourage simplistic thinking. Henri considers both perspectives carefully, weighs personal desire against collective safety, struggles with decision that impacts others beyond himself, leadership responsibility that he didn't seek but circumstances created. Finally he decides on compromise, proposes that Michel remain hidden in barn while Henri alone approaches brother-in-law's house at dusk, minimizes number of people exposed to risk while enabling reunion, accepts personal danger while protecting priest whose safety he feels responsible for maintaining. Michel protests this division immediately, insists on accompanying Henri, argues that separating abandons partnership developed through imprisonment, contends that facing danger together is morally superior to one person accepting risk to protect another. But Henri is firm, explains that his professional railway knowledge makes him specifically valuable to resistance, that losing him might cost lives beyond his own, that protecting Michel is strategic decision not just personal preference, that priest's survival serves larger purposes than simple friendship maintenance. The argument continues until elderly woman intervenes, supports Henri's position, explains that resistance needs railway engineers desperately, describes how systematic German destruction of infrastructure requires technical expertise for reconstruction, makes clear that Henri's professional skills create obligation to survive that transcends personal relationships. Michel accepts this reasoning reluctantly, understands that he's being protected not from paternalism but from strategic necessity, that his safety serves Henri's value to resistance, that accepting separation is supporting larger cause rather than simply accepting protection. Evening approaches, sunlight fading, shadows lengthening, time arriving for Henri's approach to brother-in-law's house, moment when decision transforms into action, when planning gives way to execution with its attendant risks and uncertainties. Henri prepares carefully, ensures he appears presentable despite days of imprisonment, attempts to minimize appearance of fugitive status that might attract attention, professional discipline about appearance that seems absurd given circumstances but serves practical purpose of reducing visibility. Woman provides directions carefully, describes route that avoids main streets, identifies houses where collaborators live, warns about areas where German patrols concentrate, shares local knowledge that only long-time resident possesses, information that transforms dangerous journey through hostile territory into navigable path through known risks. Henri memorizes these details, applies railway memory for complex route information to civilian navigation, professional cognitive skills transferring effectively to escape requirements. He leaves barn at dusk, moves through village shadows carefully, following route that woman described, maintaining awareness of surroundings while appearing purposeful rather than furtive, understanding that confidence often provides better concealment than obvious attempts at hiding, that looking like he belongs sometimes works better than trying to be invisible. The village is small enough that navigation is straightforward. Paul's house located within 10 minutes of careful walking, distance that seems simultaneously too long and surprisingly short, journey that feels dangerous despite minimal objective risk. He reaches house as darkness falls completely, observes it carefully before approaching, confirms no German presence visible, notes lights inside suggesting occupancy, sees evidence of normal domestic activity rather than military action or surveillance. He knocks quietly, waits with racing heart, hears footsteps approaching door, moment of vulnerability when being recognized as fugitive could result in betrayal rather than assistance, trust placed in family connection that he hasn't tested in years. Door opens revealing Paul Deschamps, Henri's brother-in-law, older than Henri remembers, worn by occupation years, but recognizably the same person, family connection that imprisonment and separation didn't erase despite time and distance. Recognition is immediate and mutual, Paul's face transforming from suspicion to shock to overwhelming joy, emotional cascade that produces tears and speechless embrace, reunion that validates Henri's risk, confirms that family bonds survived imprisonment and war, demonstrates that some connections transcend circumstances that destroy others. Paul pulls Henri inside quickly, concern for safety overriding emotional expression, understanding that prolonged visibility at doorway creates risk, that celebration must happen behind closed doors and drawn curtains, that occupation requires constant vigilance even during joyful moments. Inside, Paul's wife Marie appears, her reaction matching her husband's, family embrace that surrounds Henri with warmth he hasn't experienced in months, human connection that imprisonment systematically denied, love that endures despite everything working against it. They settle around kitchen table, need for information temporarily overriding need for emotional processing, practical questions about Henri's escape and current situation taking precedence over personal reunion details, resistance discipline that Paul demonstrates through prioritizing tactical assessment over emotional indulgence. Henri describes train transport and mechanical failure and mass escape, explains his assessment that locomotive engineers sabotaged the train deliberately, shares observation about positioning that enabled reaching this specific village, waits for Paul's reaction to these conclusions. Paul's face shows complex emotions while listening, something like pride mixed with sorrow, confirmation mixed with grief, response that suggests Henri's analysis is correct but that knowledge carries painful weight. He confirms that Henri's assessment is accurate, explains that locomotive engineer was resistance member named Thomas Claes, describes him as skilled railway worker who used professional position to sabotage German operations, notes that Claes' position trained precisely to enable escape towards safe village, reveals that Saboteur succeeded in freeing hundreds of prisoners through technical expertise and calculated risk. But Paul also shares tragic conclusion, reports that Thomas Claes was identified as Saboteur after escape occurred, explains that Wehrmacht investigation determined mechanical failure was deliberate, describes how Germans arrested Claes and executed him immediately, reveals that man who saved Henri and hundreds of others paid ultimate price for resistance action, that heroism cost him everything while enabling survival for strangers he would never meet. The news devastates Henri, gratitude for survival mixing with grief for Savior's death, awareness that his freedom came at terrible cost to someone else, survivor's guilt intensifying through concrete knowledge of specific person who died enabling his escape. Paul explains that Claes knew risks exactly, that he chose sabotage despite understanding consequences if discovered, that saving prisoners mattered more to him than personal survival, that he accepted probable death as price worth paying for hundreds of lives preserved, moral calculation that some people make and others can't comprehend, heroism that exceeds normal human capacity for self-sacrifice. Paul describes Claes as quiet man who never spoke about his resistance work, who appeared as ordinary railway employee while systematically undermining German operations, whose courage expressed itself through technical competence rather than dramatic gestures, hero whose heroism was invisible until final action revealed character that daily life concealed. Henri processes this information with difficulty, struggles to accept that stranger died specifically to save him and others, that his survival connects directly to someone else's execution, that gratitude and grief are inseparable responses to circumstances that enabled his freedom. He asks about Claes' family, learns that wife and 2 children survived, that resistance is providing support, that community honors Claes' sacrifice while assisting dependents, Belgian solidarity that occupation strengthened rather than destroyed, collective resistance that continues despite individual casualties. The conversation shifts to immediate practical concerns, Paul explaining that Henri must hide temporarily, that German search for escaped prisoners continues actively, that remaining visible creates danger for everyone, that patience is required despite understandable desire to move freely after months of imprisonment. He describes safe house where Henri can stay, resistance facility that shelters fugitives and Allied airmen, location that provides security while enabling contribution to underground operations, space where Henri's railway expertise can serve resistance effectively while he waits for liberation. Henri agrees immediately, understands necessity of continued concealment, accepts that escape from train doesn't mean escape from danger, that occupied territory remains hostile environment regardless of mass exodus success. He asks about Michel, explains priest's presence in elderly woman's barn, requests that Paul extend protection to include companion whose safety he feels responsible for maintaining, partnership obligation that transcends immediate self-interest. Paul agrees without hesitation, commits to retrieving Michel and bringing him to same safe house, accepts Henri's judgment that priest deserves protection, demonstrates resistance solidarity that includes whoever needs help regardless of selection criteria beyond simple need. He explains that retrieval will occur tomorrow night, that moving 2 people simultaneously creates unnecessary risk, that sequential transfer is tactically superior despite being emotionally unsatisfying, that patience serves everyone's security better than urgency motivated by friendship rather than necessity. Henri accepts this reasoning though he dislikes abandoning Michel even temporarily, understands that one more night in barn is minor hardship compared to risks that precipitous action might create, that protecting priest means accepting delay despite desire for immediate reunion. Paul promises that Michel will be safe, commits personally to ensuring priest's security, provides reassurance that enables Henri to accept separation without excessive guilt. That night Henri sleeps in real bed for first time in months. Comfort that should feel wonderful but instead feels strange, softness disorienting after months on hard surfaces, civilian luxury that imprisonment makes seem alien rather than normal. He lies awake for hours, mind processing events too rapidly for sleep, thoughts cycling through escape and Saboteur's sacrifice and uncertain future, emotional overload that prevents rest despite physical exhaustion. He thinks about Thomas Claes obsessively, imagines railway engineer making decision to sabotage train, pictures him calculating exactly where mechanical failure should occur, visualizes precision required to position train perfectly for maximum escape probability, professional admiration mixing with grief for colleague he never met, recognition of extraordinary competence deployed for resistance rather than collaboration. Henri understands that Claes was artist of sabotage, that positioning train required intimate knowledge of railway systems and local geography and German operational procedures, that success demanded expertise that few possessed and courage that even fewer demonstrated. Morning brings Paul's departure for work, schoolteacher role that provides cover for resistance activities, position that enables coordination of underground operations while appearing as harmless educator, occupation that Wehrmacht tolerates because education seems politically neutral when in fact Paul uses it systematically for resistance purposes. Marie explains this while serving breakfast, describes how Paul maintains appearance of compliance while actually organizing sabotage and intelligence gathering and fugitive assistance, double life that requires constant vigilance and produces tremendous stress, courage that expresses itself through sustained deception rather than dramatic action. Henri spends day in hiding, remaining inside with curtains drawn, avoiding windows and visibility, accepting confinement voluntarily after escaping involuntary imprisonment, irony that isn't lost on him though necessity is clear. Marie keeps him company intermittently, shares news about occupation and resistance and Allied advances, provides context that enables understanding larger situation beyond personal experience, information that connects individual survival to collective liberation struggle. She describes systematic German withdrawal, explains that Wehrmacht is evacuating systematically while destroying infrastructure, notes that liberation approaches but comes with cost of devastation that retreating forces inflict, warns that final phase of occupation might be most dangerous as desperate Germans become unpredictable. She reports resistance activities increasing, describes sabotage operations intensifying as German control weakens, explains that Belgian underground is preparing for liberation while continuing to resist actively, balance between caution about German reprisals and aggression enabled by weakening occupation. Evening brings Paul's return with Michel, priest looking exhausted but relieved, reunion that affirms their partnership, confirmation that neither abandoned other despite temporary separation. They embrace briefly, masculine restraint limiting emotional expression despite genuine feeling, partnership acknowledged through minimal gesture that communicates maximum meaning. Paul conducts them to safe house immediately, short walk through dark streets to building that appears ordinary externally but houses resistance operations internally, civilian facade concealing military purpose, normalcy that hides extraordinary function. Safe house interior reveals its true nature immediately, multiple fugitives visible, Allied airmen and escaped prisoners and Belgian resistance members mixing together, international community of people hiding from German occupation, collective survival network that occupation created as unintended consequence of repression, resistance infrastructure that grows stronger as occupation weakens. Henri and Michel are welcomed warmly, integrated immediately into community of fugitives, provided with sleeping spaces and basic necessities, accepted as fellow survivors rather than interrogated about credentials or background. The safe house operates with military discipline despite civilian composition. Someone maintains order through leadership that everyone accepts, rules govern behavior to minimize risk, responsibilities distribute among occupants to ensure collective security, organization that emerges from necessity rather than imposed through formal authority. Henri observes this structure with professional appreciation, recognizes efficiency that comes from clear procedures and shared commitment, understands that survival depends on cooperation rather than individualism, that collective discipline serves everyone better than personal freedom that endangers group. He's assigned to intelligence work immediately, his railway expertise identifying him as valuable resource, knowledge that resistance needs desperately as liberation approaches, technical understanding that enables sabotage planning and troop movement tracking and infrastructure assessment. Henri accepts this role eagerly, grateful for opportunity to contribute rather than simply hide, understanding that active participation in resistance provides meaning that passive survival doesn't offer, that serving cause larger than personal safety justifies risks that pure self-preservation wouldn't warrant. His first assignment involves analyzing German railway evacuation patterns, using his professional knowledge to predict Wehrmacht withdrawal routes, identifying bottlenecks where sabotage might trap retreating forces, providing tactical intelligence that enables resistance to harass German retreat effectively. Henri works with maps and railway schedules and intelligence reports, applies decades of operational experience to military analysis, discovers that skills developed for civilian purposes transfer effectively to resistance warfare, that expertise matters regardless of context when expertise is genuine and applicable. Michel serves differently, providing pastoral care to fugitives and resistance members, offering spiritual counsel that military situation makes urgently necessary, maintaining humanity through religious practice when circumstances encourage brutality and despair, priest whose ministry continues despite occupation trying to suppress it. Henri watches Michel work with admiration, recognizes that priest serves resistance as effectively as railway engineer does, that different skills contribute differently but equally, that resistance requires multiple capabilities beyond simple military action. Days pass in safe house routine, Henri contributing intelligence analysis while Michel provides pastoral support, both integrated into resistance network that operates throughout region, Belgian underground that connects villages and cities into coordinated opposition, systematic resistance that occupation couldn't prevent despite brutal repression. They learn about larger war context, hear news of Allied advances from multiple directions, understand that liberation approaches daily, that German occupation will end soon though exact timing remains uncertain. Henri also learns more about Thomas Claes during this period, speaks with resistance members who knew him, hears stories about Saboteurs' other operations, discovers pattern of technical resistance that Claes maintained for years, railway work that appeared compliant but systematically undermined German operations, heroism that expressed itself through accumulated small actions rather than single dramatic gesture. The picture that emerges is of quiet extraordinary man who used professional position brilliantly for resistance purposes, who saved countless lives through technical expertise and moral courage, whose final action freeing trained prisoners was culmination of years of systematic sabotage. Henri asks whether Claes knew specific prisoners he was saving, learns that Saboteur had no idea who occupied train cars, that he saved strangers without knowing their identities or stories, pure act of humanitarian resistance that required no personal connection to justify extraordinary risk. This knowledge intensifies Henri's grief and gratitude simultaneously, understanding that he benefited from moral action that didn't depend on relationship or obligation, that stranger chose to save him simply because saving lives mattered regardless of whose lives they were, ethics that transcends familial or national or religious categories that usually motivate self-sacrifice. He decides to honor Claes' memory through continued resistance service, commits to contributing his railway expertise as effectively as possible, pledges to himself that surviving Claes' sacrifice requires serving cause that Saboteur died for, that gratitude demands action rather than just feeling, that debt can be paid only through dedication to liberation that Claes enabled but didn't survive to witness. This commitment transforms Henri's resistance work from necessity into vocation, from temporary survival strategy into meaningful purpose, moral obligation that provides structure and meaning that pure self-preservation doesn't offer. March becomes April, winter giving way to spring, seasonal change that mirrors political transformation as German occupation collapses systematically, Wehrmacht withdrawing toward Germany, Allied forces approaching from multiple directions, liberation imminent though exact timeline varies by location. The safe house receives increasing intelligence about German evacuation, reports of systematic infrastructure destruction, accounts of desperate retreating forces becoming unpredictable and dangerous, warnings that final days of occupation might produce violence exceeding previous periods. Henri works intensively during this period, analyzing German railway movements, predicting evacuation routes, identifying targets for sabotage that will delay Wehrmacht withdrawal and accelerate Allied advance, contributing technical intelligence that resistance uses to harass retreating forces effectively. His analysis proves consistently accurate, professional expertise translating into tactical advantage, recognition that his survival serves concrete military purpose beyond personal continuation, that Claes' sacrifice enabled Henri's contribution to liberation that Saboteur initiated but couldn't complete. April brings news of Allied breakthrough, reports of British and American forces advancing rapidly, intelligence suggesting liberation is days not weeks away, confirmation that occupation is ending finally after 5 years of German control, victory that Belgian resistance contributed to through sustained opposition that cost thousands of lives including Thomas Claes. The safe house prepares for liberation actively, resistance members coordinating with approaching Allied forces, planning to seize control of key infrastructure before Germans can destroy it completely, organizing to fill power vacuum that Wehrmacht withdrawal will create temporarily. Henri participates in these preparations, provides railway expertise for plans to seize train stations and prevent track destruction, contributes technical knowledge to schemes for maintaining transportation infrastructure through transition from German control to Allied administration, serves resistance purposes that align perfectly with his professional skills and moral commitments. He works alongside Michel, their partnership continuing through liberation preparation as it sustained them through imprisonment and escape, relationship that transcends circumstances that created it, friendship that will survive into peace that war is finally producing. Liberation arrives finally on April 16, British forces entering village, Wehrmacht withdrawing without significant resistance, occupation ending through systematic German retreat rather than dramatic battle, anticlimactic conclusion to 5 years of brutal control, victory that produces relief more than celebration, exhaustion more than joy. Henri and Michel emerge from safe house into liberated village, free men in free Belgium, survivors of imprisonment and escape and occupation, beneficiaries of Thomas Claes' sacrifice and resistance network's protection, people whose continued existence testifies to courage of those who saved them at cost of their own lives. They walk through village together, observing British troops and celebrating civilians, witnessing liberation that seemed impossible during imprisonment, freedom that Claes enabled but didn't live to experience, victory that resistance achieved through accumulated sacrifice rather than single dramatic action. Henri thinks about Saboteur constantly, wishes Claes could witness liberation he died to enable, feels overwhelming gratitude mixed with grief that man who saved hundreds won't see peace he helped create, survivor's guilt intensified by concrete knowledge of specific person whose death enabled his survival. But he also understands that honoring Claes requires building peace worth dying for, that gratitude demands creating world that justifies sacrifice, that debt can be paid only through living well and serving others and maintaining memory of those who gave everything so others could have futures they wouldn't survive to share. Henri commits to this obligation completely, accepts that his survival carries responsibility beyond personal happiness, that freedom requires service to community and dedication to values that resistance defended, that Thomas Claes' legacy lives through actions of those he saved rather than monuments or official recognition. The train to nowhere ended in liberation, journey that began as evacuation toward death transformed through sabotage into path to freedom, transport that delivered prisoners not to German camps but to Belgian village where resistance protected them until Allied forces arrived, machinery of repression converted through technical expertise into instrument of liberation. System designed for murder repurposed for salvation through courage and skill of one railway engineer who understood that professional knowledge carries moral obligations that transcend employment requirements or personal safety. The Train to Nowhere, Act 3. April 1945. Liberation transforms village from occupied territory into free Belgium, British forces establishing administration, Wehrmacht retreating systematically, civilian population emerging from years of oppression into uncertain peace. Henri and Michel remain in Sint-Katelijne-Waver temporarily, helping coordinate transition, providing testimony about German atrocities, contributing to documentation that will support war crimes prosecutions, serving purposes that survival enables but death would have prevented. Henri focuses particularly on railway reconstruction, works with British military engineers assessing damage Wehrmacht inflicted during retreat, catalogues destroyed infrastructure requiring repair, prioritizes repairs based on strategic importance and feasibility, applies professional expertise to rebuilding what Germans systematically destroyed. The work is technically demanding and emotionally satisfying, constructive purpose after months of surviving passively, contribution to recovery rather than just escape from destruction, meaning that imprisonment couldn't provide but freedom enables. He insists on visiting Thomas Claes' family, needs to meet widow and children of man who saved him, obligation he feels despite knowing that meeting will be emotionally devastating, that confronting direct beneficiary of husband's sacrifice might hurt family rather than comfort them. Paul accompanies him, provides introduction and moral support, helps navigate interaction that both men understand will be difficult but necessary, witness to obligation that Henri must fulfill regardless of personal cost. Claes' widow Anna receives them in small house on village outskirts, woman in her 30s worn by grief and deprivation, 2 children visible behind her, boy perhaps 10 and girl maybe 7, family that occupation damaged and husband's execution shattered, people surviving despite catastrophic loss. Henri introduces himself carefully, explains that he escaped from train Thomas sabotaged, describes how husband's technical expertise and courage enabled freedom for hundreds of prisoners, attempts to convey gratitude that words inadequately express. Anna listens silently, face impassive, emotions controlled through discipline that grief demanded, widow who has processed husband's death during weeks since execution, woman who understands intellectually that Thomas died heroically but feels primarily absence rather than pride, loss that transcends political meaning regardless of sacrifice's importance. She thanks Henri for visiting, acknowledges his gratitude politely, maintains composure that barely conceals devastation underneath, demonstrates strength that widowhood requires when children depend on mother's stability. Henri asks about family's needs, offers assistance that gratitude demands, commits to providing ongoing support that will honor Thomas's sacrifice practically rather than just emotionally, understands that helping widow and children serves obligation better than expressions of sympathy however sincere. Anna accepts cautiously, pride resisting charity but necessity overcoming resistance, practical woman who recognizes that refusing help serves no purpose when children need support, mother whose obligations to living outweigh emotional preferences about accepting assistance. They establish arrangement where Henri will contribute financially from railway salary when employment resumes, modest support that won't solve all problems but will ease immediate hardships, practical assistance that honors Thomas's memory through sustained action rather than temporary gesture. Henri commits completely, understands that this obligation will continue for years, accepts that surviving Thomas's sacrifice means responsibility for family that Saboteur left behind, debt that can't be fully repaid but must be acknowledged through continuous effort. The visit concludes with Anna showing Henri photograph of Thomas, railway engineer in work clothes standing beside locomotive, professional portrait that captures competence and quiet dignity, image of ordinary man who performed extraordinary acts without apparent drama or self-consciousness, hero whose heroism expressed itself through technical excellence rather than martial valor. Henri studies photograph intensely, memorizes features of man he never met but owes everything to, Saboteur whose face he will carry mentally for rest of his life, conscience that will guide future decisions through remembered obligation to stranger who saved him. He leaves Anna's house emotionally exhausted, grief for Thomas mixing with gratitude for survival, awareness that his continued existence connects inseparably to another's death, psychological burden that survivors carry always, moral complexity that resists easy resolution or comfortable narratives. Paul walks beside him silently, understands that words fail at moments like this, that presence matters more than speech, that witnessing Henri's grief serves friendship better than attempting to explain or comfort or minimize. They return to Paul's house where Marie has prepared dinner, domestic normalcy that seems bizarre after years of occupation and months of imprisonment, civilian routine that Henri struggles to readjust to despite liberation, peacetime rhythms that feel alien after extended period when survival dominated every thought and action. The meal is simple but abundant compared to prison rations, food that Henri consumes mechanically without tasting, nutrition his body needs but his mind can't appreciate, sustenance that enables continuation but doesn't produce pleasure. Michel joins them, priest having spent day providing pastoral care to villagers, hearing confessions and conducting services and counseling traumatized people, ministry that liberation makes urgent as psychological wounds emerge that occupation required suppressing, delayed grief and guilt and anger surfacing now that safety enables emotional processing. He describes this work matter-of-factly, notes that entire community carries trauma requiring years to heal, observes that liberation is beginning of recovery rather than conclusion of suffering, understands that winning war doesn't resolve psychological damage that fighting produced. Henri recognizes truth in Michel's assessment, applies observation to himself, understands that escaping imprisonment is just first step in longer process of recovering from trauma, that freedom doesn't automatically restore psychological health that captivity damaged, that healing requires time and effort beyond simple absence of threat. He asks Michel about this process, seeks guidance about how to live with survivors' guilt and traumatic memories and knowledge that his survival cost another's life, questions that priest has spent day helping others address, problems that liberation makes visible rather than resolving. Michel responds thoughtfully, acknowledges that no simple answers exist, explains that healing requires accepting complexity rather than demanding resolution, that living with guilt and gratitude simultaneously is necessary rather than choosing between them, that honoring sacrifice means building meaningful life rather than just feeling appropriate emotions. He describes this as moral obligation that survivors carry, responsibility to justify through good living the deaths that enabled their survival, commitment to creating world worth dying for by living well and serving others and maintaining memory of those who didn't survive. This conversation continues late into evening, three men discussing survival's meaning and obligation's nature and how to live ethically after experiencing evil, philosophical dialogue that occupation and resistance created necessity for, moral reasoning that war makes urgent rather than abstract. They reach no definite conclusions, but discussion itself provides value, articulating questions that each carries privately, sharing burden through collective examination, processing trauma through intellectual engagement that complements emotional experience. Days pass, liberation's initial relief giving way to complex reality of post-occupation existence, discovery that peace brings its own challenges different from but not necessarily easier than war's problems, transition that requires psychological adjustment beyond simple relief at danger's absence. Henri struggles particularly with purposelessness, discovering that survival loses urgency when survival is secure, that meaning developed through resistance evaporates when resistance is no longer necessary, existential challenge that many survivors face when crisis that defined existence concludes. Railway work provides partial solution, reconstruction offering purpose that fills void left by resistance activities, technical challenges that engage professional expertise, contribution to recovery that serves community meaningfully. British military needs Henri's knowledge desperately, relies on him to assess damage and coordinate repairs and train Belgian workers, positions him as essential figure in infrastructure reconstruction, gives him authority and responsibility that occupation denied but liberation enables. He works intensely through May 12-hour days examining tracks and bridges and stations, cataloging destruction and planning repairs, coordinating between British engineers and Belgian workers, applying technical knowledge and administrative skills that decades of railway employment developed. The work exhausts him physically but satisfies psychologically, purposeful activity that produces visible results, construction replacing destruction, building replacing surviving, meaning that transcends personal continuation. But nightmares persist, sleep bringing him back to cattle car and imprisonment and fear, unconscious mind processing trauma that conscious awareness tries to suppress, psychological wounds that safety enables addressing rather than healing automatically. He wakes regularly from dreams of confinement and suffocation and helplessness, body responding to remembered threats as though they remain present, trauma's persistence despite changed circumstances, evidence that liberation freed his body but not entirely his mind. Michel recognizes these symptoms, has seen them in countless traumatized parishioners, understands that Henri carries invisible wounds requiring treatment beyond simple time and safety, psychological damage that won't heal without active intervention. He encourages Henri to discuss nightmares and fears, offers priestly counsel that combines spiritual guidance with practical psychological insight, provides support that acknowledges suffering without pathologizing normal trauma responses, helps Henri understand that what he experiences is expected consequence of extraordinary circumstances rather than personal weakness. These conversations help significantly, Henri discovering that articulating fear and guilt reduces their power, that sharing burden through trusted relationship makes carrying it more bearable, that processing trauma through language enables gradual integration rather than simple suppression. Michel serves as witness to Henri's suffering, validates experience through attentive listening, provides perspective that normalizes responses Henri fears indicate psychological breakdown, support that enables healing through acceptance rather than demanding immediate resolution. June brings increasing stability, British administration establishing functional government, Belgian authorities returning from exile, civil society reconstituting after years of occupation, transition from military governance to civilian control, normalization that enables imagining future beyond mere survival. Henri receives official appointment as regional railway director, position recognizing his expertise and resistance service, authority enabling systematic reconstruction beyond patchwork repairs, opportunity to rebuild infrastructure comprehensively rather than just restore minimum functionality. He accepts this position with mixed emotions, honored by recognition but aware that authority brings responsibility, that decisions will affect thousands of people, that mistakes will have real consequences beyond personal impact. Paul counsels him to accept despite doubts, argues that competence creates obligation to serve, that refusing position means less capable person filling it, that Henri's technical knowledge and moral character qualify him uniquely, that resistance earned him right to shape peace it helped create. Henri agrees finally, commits to position that will define his post-war life, accepts that his survival requires service rather than simple continuation, that honoring Thomas Claes means building world worth the sacrifice, that recovery from trauma happens through purposeful action rather than passive healing. He begins work immediately, assembles team of railway workers and engineers, establishes priorities for reconstruction, allocates limited resources according to strategic importance rather than political pressure, applies professional judgment that decades of experience developed and resistance refined. The work is enormous, German destruction having been systematic and thorough, infrastructure damage deliberately to delay Allied advance, sabotage that succeeded militarily but created enormous reconstruction burden, devastation that will require years to fully repair. Henri addresses this methodically, breaks overwhelming task into manageable components, establishes timeline based on available resources and realistic capabilities, manages expectations while maintaining forward progress, leadership that combines technical competence with administrative skill. Michel remains in village, establishes permanent ministry serving community still recovering from occupation trauma, provides spiritual guidance to people wrestling with war's moral complexity, helps families process losses and survivors manage guilt and community address collaboration's legacy, pastoral work that peace makes possible but war made necessary. He maintains close friendship with Henri, weekly conversations that continue processing shared experience, relationship that transcends circumstances that created it, bond formed through imprisonment that strengthens through freedom. July brings news that transforms Henri's understanding of his experience, information that recontextualizes escape and obligation and meaning in ways that both comfort and disturb, knowledge that arrived too late to change actions but fundamentally alters their interpretation. British intelligence officers investigating German war crimes discover documents revealing that train Henri escaped from wasn't heading toward transit camp but toward extermination facility, that prisoners were designated for immediate execution upon arrival, that mechanical failure and subsequent escapes saved lives not temporarily but definitively, that freedom Thomas Claes enabled wasn't delay but prevention of murder. This information devastates and validates simultaneously, confirms that escape was life or death moment rather than temporary liberation from imprisonment, proves that Thomas's sacrifice saved hundreds from certain death rather than uncertain fate, demonstrates that risk he took and price he paid prevented massacre rather than just postponing incarceration. Henri processes this knowledge with difficulty, understanding that his survival wasn't fortunate but miraculous, that owing life to Thomas means something even deeper than he recognized, that obligation extends beyond gratitude into existential debt that can never be adequately repaid. He visits Anna again, shares this information carefully, explains that Thomas saved hundreds of people from certain death rather than temporary imprisonment, that sacrifice prevented murder rather than just enabled escape, that husband died preventing atrocity rather than just facilitating temporary freedom. Anna receives this news silently, tears flowing despite maintained composure, grief transforming slightly through knowledge that Thomas's death prevented massacre, that his sacrifice saved hundreds of lives definitively rather than temporarily, that meaning was absolute rather than conditional. They sit together quietly, widow and survivor processing knowledge that transforms understanding without changing essential reality, information that provides context without offering comfort, facts that explain without consoling. Henri renews his commitment to supporting family, understands that obligation deepens with knowledge of what Thomas prevented, accepts that his continued existence represents lives saved rather than just imprisonment avoided, survivor whose survival justifies sacrifice through prevented deaths rather than just enabled freedoms. Summer progresses, reconstruction advancing steadily, railway system gradually returning to functionality, infrastructure enabling economic recovery that liberation initiated but transportation sustains, technical achievement that Henri orchestrates through sustained effort, professional accomplishment that provides purpose and meaning beyond simple survival. He works without seeking recognition, serves without demanding acknowledgement, leads through competence rather than claiming authority, modesty that Thomas Claes embodied and that Henri consciously emulates. August brings war's absolute conclusion, Japan's surrender ending global conflict, victory that Belgium contributed to through resistance and suffering and sacrifice, peace that thousands of Belgians including Thomas Claes died to enable, cessation of violence that permits beginning of recovery that will require decades. Henri marks this moment quietly, understands that peace Thomas died for has arrived, that world he sacrificed to create now exists, that responsibility to honor his memory through good living becomes even more urgent in peace than war. He establishes memorial fund for Thomas Claes, dedicates portion of salary permanently to supporting scholarship for railway workers' children, ensures that Saboteurs' memory persists through practical assistance rather than abstract monument, honors sacrifice through ongoing action that serves community rather than one-time gesture that enables forgetting. Anna receives first scholarship for her children, support that will enable education Thomas valued but couldn't provide, opportunity that extends father's legacy through children's future rather than simply commemorating his death. Autumn brings Henri's decision to remain permanently in Saint-Cataline waiver rather than returning to Liège, choice to build life near where Thomas saved him rather than resume previous existence, commitment to community that sheltered him and memory that obligates him, geographic decision that reflects moral priorities. He purchases small house near railway station, establishes permanent residence, creates life that honors rescue rather than just continuing existence that escape enabled. Michel performs marriage ceremony when Henri weds local woman in November, union that represents beginning of post-war life, commitment to future rather than just processing past, relationship that enables moving forward while maintaining memory, love that coexists with obligation rather than replacing it. Henri names first son Thomas, born following year, continuation of name rather than simple commemoration, living memorial that carries Saboteurs' legacy into future through child who will never meet man whose sacrifice enabled his existence. Years pass, Henri serving as railway director through Reconstruction period and into prosperity, building career that serves community effectively, contributing expertise that benefits thousands of people, living well in ways that honor Thomas Claes through sustained service rather than dramatic gesture. He visits Anna regularly, maintains support that continues through her children's education and into their adult lives, fulfills commitment that gratitude demanded and that he never abandons despite changed circumstances. Michel remains close friend throughout, their partnership continuing through peacetime as it sustained them through imprisonment and resistance, relationship that transcends originating circumstances, friendship that persists because it's genuine rather than just circumstantial. They discuss theology and ethics and meaning, conversations that continue processing war experience while addressing peace's challenges, intellectual engagement that provides ongoing growth rather than just trauma recovery. Henri speaks publicly about Thomas Claes occasionally, ensures community remembers Saboteur's sacrifice, tells story to schoolchildren and civic organizations and railway workers, maintains memory through repeated telling that prevents forgetting, testimony that honors through narrative rather than monument. He describes technical brilliance and moral courage, explains how professional expertise served resistance purposes, emphasizes that heroism expressed itself through quiet competence rather than dramatic action, challenges glamorized narratives that obscure ordinary people's extraordinary contributions. Decades pass, Henri aging into elderly railway director, respected community figure, survivor whose survival served purposes beyond personal continuation, man who lived well enough to partially justify sacrifice that enabled his life. Thomas Claes' children become productive adults, educated through scholarship their father's sacrifice funded, successful through opportunities his death enabled, living testaments to meaning that extends beyond memorial or commemoration into actual continued existence of lives that wouldn't exist without Saboteur's courage. Henri retires in 1970, 25 years of railway service in peacetime following 30 years before war, career defined by competence and integrity, professional life that honored Thomas through excellence rather than just acknowledgement. He continues visiting Anna until her death in 1975, maintains commitment across 3 decades, friendship that transcended obligations origins to become genuine connection, relationship that honored Thomas through caring for family rather than just remembering sacrifice. Michel dies in 1978, priest who served community through war and peace, friend who witnessed Henri's journey from imprisonment through recovery to productive peace, companion whose presence enabled processing trauma and building meaning, relationship that sustained both men through shared experience and mutual support. Henri delivers eulogy, describes partnership that began in cattle car and continued through liberation into peace, friendship that transcended circumstances to become defining relationship, bond that war created but peace sustained and death concludes. Henri lives until 1992, reaches 89 years old, survives imprisonment by 47 years, builds long life that justified Thomas Claes' sacrifice through sustained service and genuine contribution, existence that honored rescue through living well rather than just surviving. He maintains Thomas's memory until final days, tells story repeatedly to ensure forgetting doesn't erase sacrifice, testimony that keeps Saboteur's courage alive through narrative preservation, witness whose witnessing serves memorial function beyond monuments or official recognition. Before death, Henri records complete testimony about train escape and Thomas Claes' sabotage, detailed account preserved for historical record, documentation that ensures story survives beyond participants' lives, evidence that resistance included technical brilliance alongside military action, proof that ordinary people's extraordinary courage saved lives through professional expertise rather than just martial valor. The testimony becomes primary source for historians, referenced in studies of Belgian resistance and railway sabotage and Holocaust rescue. Henri's words preserving Thomas's memory through academic record that extends beyond community memory into historical documentation. Henri's funeral is attended by hundreds, community honoring railway director who served effectively, survivors remembering man who maintained Thomas Claes' memory, families celebrating life well lived. Thomas Claes' children attend, now elderly themselves, people whose existence testifies to Saboteur's success, lives that wouldn't exist without father's sacrifice and Henri's commitment to supporting them, human continuation that makes abstract sacrifice concrete and meaningful. The railway station Henri directed for 25 years is renamed Thomas Claes Station posthumously, official recognition that Henri requested and community granted, memorial that serves practical purpose rather than just symbolic function, place where thousands pass daily, infrastructure that honors Saboteur through utility rather than mere commemoration. Plaque describes Claes' sabotage and sacrifice, explains how technical expertise served resistance, tells story that Henri spent decades preserving, narrative that continues beyond his death through official commemoration that his advocacy enabled. The train to nowhere ended in liberation, journey that should have concluded in death transformed through sabotage into path to life, transport that delivered prisoners to freedom rather than execution, machinery of murder converted into instrument of salvation through one engineer's courage and technical brilliance, system designed for genocide repurposed for rescue through professional expertise and moral commitment that transcended self-preservation to serve humanity. Thomas Claes died saving strangers, executed for resistance that freed hundreds of people he would never meet, saboteur whose sacrifice enabled futures he couldn't share, hero whose heroism expressed itself through technical excellence rather than martial drama, ordinary man who performed extraordinary acts that saved lives through professional knowledge deployed for moral purposes. His memory persists through Henri's testimony and scholarship fund and railway station and lives of those he saved, legacy that extends beyond death into continued existence that justified sacrifice, meaning that transcends individual to serve community and humanity. Henri honored that sacrifice through life well lived, service sustained across decades, commitment maintained despite changed circumstances, obligation fulfilled through continuous action rather than temporary gesture, gratitude expressed through building world worth dying for rather than just feeling appropriate emotions. His survival served purpose beyond personal continuation, justified Thomas's sacrifice through contribution that multiplied rescue's impact, existence that created meaning from tragedy through dedication to values that Saboteur died defending. The story endures, preserved through testimony and commemoration, narrative that reminds subsequent generations that resistance took many forms, that technical expertise served liberation alongside military action, that ordinary people's extraordinary courage saved lives through professional competence, that sacrifice and service and sustained commitment create meaning that transcends individual circumstances to serve collective memory and ongoing obligation to honor those who gave everything, so others could have futures they wouldn't survive to share.